me know if you can see my screen share, please. All right, let's start off with some quick housekeeping, friends. Kianga, do you want to take this first item?
Sure, yes, happy to. Welcome everyone to our ReFi ABC subcommittee meeting. I wanted to give all of our delegates a little heads up about some internal administrative things that are going on at MakerDAOs. We're going to be undelegating over the next couple of days, probably this week. For just as background, last quarter, MakerDAOs delegated 1 MKR to everyone who signed up to follow this ABC. And it was, a gesture to encourage participation in the new governance structure, and also, to give everyone the best feeling and opportunity to actually vote, because of course, all of you know who are delegates, without MKR in your contract, you can't actually cast a vote. But for the second quarter, we want to think about delegation from the MakerDAO's treasury a little bit differently. And so this is a process that will start, as I mentioned, this week. And, it'll probably take a little bit of time before I can circle back with exactly sort of what the criteria will be. We definitely want to, and this is something that I've discussed with Space Exponential as well, thinking about how the MakerDAO's delegation can be part of, signaling our appreciation for, the most impactful delegates, and, just sort of be a way that we can additionally reward great work. But that's not going to be a decision made by me, Kianga. So I've got to be involved in coordinating with MakerDAO's Acre token holders, and we'll consult with Space Exponential, of course, about exactly what's a very aligned way to think about incentives that MakerDAOs as a community can do its small part. So, just a heads up that you'll see that delegation being withdrawn, and I know that impacts a number of delegates who have only a delegation from MakerDAOs. And I guess just a thought on that, all of you have your own strategies, I guess, how you're thinking about your participation. But certainly from our perspective at ReFi ABC, we would love to see that you continue to give us your full reasoning, even if you're no longer able to physically vote, if our withdrawing the 1 MKR from MakerDAOs disrupts your ability to actually vote. This is just my personal thinking is that, and that applies, across the board. I think that still participating and publishing discussion is a great way for delegates to maybe attract delegation from others. So I've seen a lot of folks say that, they don't have MKR in a particular GSL, and so they don't really engage in a discussion. But I think it's, probably still worthwhile to do that. And in preparation for this, we did inquire with Gov Alpha and confirmed that this will not affect anyone's compensation participation metrics. So to the extent that your GSL has just an MKR from MakerDAOs and we withdraw the delegation and you can't physically vote, you're not penalized for that in terms of suddenly now you're only counted for the votes you have on the one GSL. So if there's any questions about that, let's deal with them async in the Discord or on the forum. Don't want to take up any more time on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Kianga. And just a quick note for the aligned delegates who are following us, thank you for your advisories and the ecosystem intelligence reports. We do want to strongly encourage that you do your best to get those into us by Friday. Kianga and I had a chat today about possibly moving the meetings later in the week, but we realized that just in terms of like the rhythm of the week, Tuesday really works best. And so we would really appreciate getting those reports, those weekly work products to us by Friday so that we actually have time during the weekend to review and to integrate fully for these meetings, for these Tuesday meetings. Otherwise, we feel that folks that are turning it in late, we might not be able to give the full attention that you deserve to these work products because they're coming in after the deadline and they can't be integrated into our weekly chat. Thank you so much, True Name. And again, really, really appreciate you and the rest of the Align delegates for the exceptional work product that we received this week. So having a look quickly through the icons in our channel, most are familiar to me. I am seeing two folks with DAO Masons in their identifier. If you feel like it, we warmly encourage you to perhaps come off mute or type an introduction. We always love to see new friends in the chat, so it's good to see Jord and UI369 from DAO Masons. And again, would love to quick introduction to y'all and see what has brought you into our circles today.
Hey there, hello.
Hello.
Yeah, we're part of a DAO called DAO Masons, and with the GovAlpha team, they're orchestrating their handoff to new team members. We're kind of going through their training and screening process and just trying to get as much context about MakerDAO as possible. Saw this pop up and had a quick look at the forum post and thought it would be good context for us to have. So really here as observers, learning. And thanks for the invitation to speak up.
Amazing, my friend. Thank you. Thank you for introducing yourself. And please feel free to jump in and ask questions and contribute anytime you feel inspired to. I'll be keeping an eye on the chat. All right, so we have quite a bit to go through. I wanted to dive into the protocol scope advisories, and for our friends from the DAO Masons, we are asking the Align delegates who are following ReFi AVC to give us 2 items of work product each week, because they really are like the crucial interface between AVCs, the larger like grassroots maker token holding community, and the core of governance. So their research and their analysis is super, super important. I just want to run through very quickly some of these. I'm not going to spend too much time on them, but I always share the slides after the fact so that you can dig into these details more if you'd like. So Defensor is, he brought up something quite interesting, bottleneck identifier. They said that this is quite important for the protocol scope. Specifically getting transparency into the interdependencies between the various entities, ecosystem actors, etc. For instance, the example that they brought up was governance delays in reviewing spells can cause delays for the protocol team, can cause delays for pull-up labs, for instance. So is there some sort of reporting framework? Is there some sort of structure that we can put in place so that identities, bottlenecks can be identified before they become bottlenecks? I think this is a very important open question. Cloaky, Bonapublica, and Sappho all asked for clarity on budgets. This makes perfect sense. Protocol 4.1, we see that there's a multi-chain engineering budget that can be used to bootstrap other technology in addition to the 2-stage bridge. And I believe Cloaky was asking, what about Teleport? Is Teleport something that justifiably could receive funding from this budget? And we're also needing clarity on the specific criteria for funding projects from the new chain or the multi-chain engineering budgets. Yes, great point. The defensors item. The next thing is governance security, and this was brought up by True Name. Taiwanese discourages decentralized ecosystem of non-maker devs, which is something that I had never thought about. I was not at all cognizant of the Taiwanese, we shall say. But here the Discord discussion is linked if you want to check out what Rune and other people said in the Discord about that. And I think that's a very good thing to call out. The fourth item here is the Advisory Council. Navigators asking, how can we integrate the Advisory Council into existing work streams? Can, for instance, an Advisory Council member select proposals for a new chain budget? I'm not sure if this is actually allowed for under the Atlas. I'd be keen to see others' input. I was able to pull out the language in the Atlas that says that the Advisory Council members are limited to upgrades to scope artifacts, proposing upgrades to scope artifacts. So I think this would probably fall more under ecosystem actor domain. But again, would be open to hearing others' input. Last item here, timelines and roadmaps. We are all keen for more timelines and roadmaps of core product development, and this we heard from Navigator, TrueName, and Sappho. What is the progress to date? What information can be made available? Surely there's something that can be spoken about. And then I believe it was either TrueName or Navigator that suggested that all the different timelines that are specified in the scopes are overlaid to get a view of all the dependencies and the sequencing. So these are all very, very crucial callouts. Thank you for the advisories once again. I'm sure this will be very valuable when Kyanga and I are formulating our next alignment proposals, scope alignment proposals. Okay, let's go through the ecosystem intelligence. This is the first one, I believe. This was Kyanga. Kyanga actually notified me as to this discussion, but I thought it was quite important. It is from Rune, so I think, Kyanga, and feel free to come off mute and correct me, but I feel that it may signal a shift in what Rune is thinking about AVCs. At the beginning, there was a little bit of contradiction because he said AVC members can do this work as a fun hobby. Haha. And then but he also said that it was a very crucial position in the entire endgame ecosystem. So in a very recent post, Rune is saying managing a stablecoin isn't something that can be done as a fun hobby. However, with endgame, we'll attempt to at least gamify that last mile and make the voting process gamified and fun. That still won't be the governance. That part still has to happen. And it's going to be very challenging to achieve a combination of engaged and skilled participants that do not have major conflicts of interest the way that delegates or facilitators have. But in theory, he says, if we have just a single aligned governance participant, they will be able to be a check on all of the delegates, et cetera, and nullify all of their conflict of interest risks. Kyanga, did you want to add any commentary here, my friend?
Sure, I'll be really brief because I was thinking about this some more, and I think the mystery here is who's considered to be a manager of the stablecoin. And as I thought about it, it may be that the managing of the stablecoin is sort of referring to the workforce and not necessarily what we're doing here. So maybe there's not a contradiction. Maybe this is still supposed to be a fun hobby. But I think it's still an important kind of thing that we continue to think about, which is, what are the incentive alignments for attracting ABC members, and how is the work that we do here supported, and if it's the right balance of incentives.
Thank you, my friend. Thanks for calling that out for us. Now we have something very, very important, top of mind, hot topic of discussion in the Discord, Paper Imperium on the Harbor Trade RWA Vault default, and this was emphasized in the EI reports of Cloaky and TrueName. So TLDR, for those who are not yet caught up to speed, this vault structure somehow allowed junior Paper Imperium. Yes, you did. You made the news. Notorious now. So the vault structure somehow allowed junior capital participants to redeem their tokens, placing the burden on MakerDAO. This occurrence appears highly unusual in the lending industry and exposes MakerDAO to more risk than initially anticipated. Surprisingly, no action has been taken thus far to address this default, which occurred several months ago. And here we see Paper Imperium, the notorious Paper Imperium, saying, can you elaborate on the mitigation measures? Why are we not asking for the debt ceiling to be lowered? I think it's also clear that no one else realized this issue is occurring, so whatever communication you did needs to be supplemented in the future, perhaps tagging governance or delegates or breaking out into a separate post or poll. So the importance for refi AVC, two very interesting, sorry, my computer's freezing up. Tech difficulties today. Clokey is saying that there are avoidable losses, diminish the resources available for public goods initiatives, including the support of regenerative finance, and calling out that the underlying causes for this inaction appears to be an unclear distinction of responsibility. Clokey then says there are two ecosystem actors whose responsibilities are not explicitly defined beyond the broad mandate of utilizing the budget for valuable contributions to the maker ecosystem. And then Clokey recommends establishing clear and comprehensive responsibilities, ensuring greater accountability, and audit responsibilities to ensure sufficiency. Clokey, are you here? Yes, Clokey is here. Maybe you could type a little bit. There we go. Thank you so much. I was about to ask that. So Steakhouse Financial and Tech, those are the two ecosystem actors whose responsibilities are not defined. Now, True Name also has some really important contributions. And he's pointing out that the misalignment of the adequate incentives to ensure RWA collateral structures have monitoring that leads to quick and effective governance actions for mitigating losses. And many of refi AVC's stated ambitions to impact the real world will require the utmost integrity and protection in every area where MakerDAO must rely on off-chain markets and legal agreements mediated privately through agents appointed and or authorized by Maker governance votes. So action items here, Clokey is sharing that refi delegates request these ecosystem actors to define their responsibilities. How do y'all feel about that? Kianga, I'm wondering how you feel about this action item. I'm not sure if it would overstep any boundaries. I don't know if it's inappropriate, but it's a very interesting question. And then the second action item is just to put processes for collaboration in place among the alignment conservers so that we are reinforcing one another's knowledge and these important incidents are not slipping through the cracks. So that's from Clokey, and True Name is recommending that we prioritize advisory council members for the stability scope without any conflicts of interest who can independently monitor these deals and make specific recommendations for the benefit of and from the exclusive perspective of maker holders. I think this is a terrific recommendation. Consider an entity, perhaps delegated committee, tasked with monitoring off-chain transaction structures. Go ahead, my friend.
Oh yeah, I was just going to say on that, I think, yeah, we've got to untangle this a little bit in terms of whatever the constraints are on delegates around interacting with ecosystem participants, the constraints on us for micromanaging, and then the kind of requirement that we're making proposals on the improvement articles. So to the extent that ABC members are proposing things for anything other than basically advisory councils, I believe it's very explicit instructions that the delegates kind of do not need to follow anything that we're saying and should just sort of vote their own views. So yeah, I don't know how all that shakes out. I love the comments and the recommendations. It's a super important area. And maybe the way to do it is, yeah, I'm not sure, but something, yeah, to untangle. And we welcome suggestions on, you know, how to kind of get traction on some of these points with the limitations in place.
Thanks, Kianga. And a quick question here for True Name. True Name noted, I believe this was in the Discord, we note the proposal having to do with the poll for setting the DC limit to 0. The proposal was not a recommendation to set the ceiling to 0, but for maker holders and delegates to decide. My question, True Name, I couldn't see where you sourced this. Where were you seeing that the proposal was not a recommendation to set the ceiling to 0, but for maker holders and delegates to decide? That was my question for you. Quickly check the chat. All good. Okay. Our next item of ecosystem intelligence. I don't know how to pronounce this. Solidity Labs, I'm assuming, new ecosystem actor. And apparently they were the guest last week, Kianga tells me, for Sovereign Finance ABC meeting. So essentially here, they are proposing to join as a new ecosystem actor, and one of their capabilities is to automate governance with LLM AI systems, which is very exciting. They say in their forum post that Maker governance needs some automated process to review posts. Think about a CI/CD process for Maker proposals. LLMs like GPT-4 can review proposals for consistency with previously stated rules. Our team has the experience to build such automated checks, reducing human error and enabling contributors to focus on tasks with higher added value. So this is pertinent to the ReFi AVC, says Navigator, because we value maximal inclusiveness and participation, especially from those outside the Maker ecosystem. So finally, we might have the concrete expertise and the capacity to actually put this into effect that will be necessary to build a toolkit to bridge the gap and the learning curve that currently exists between quote unquote Maker insiders and those outside the ecosystem. Thank you, True Name. True Name is saying we can share a link to the discussion. It was just a clarification that SF had initially not recommended a specific result, but just recommended that a poll take place. And this was actually in the Discord. I was looking on the forum, True Name, so thank you for clarifying that. And the possible action item here, which is very interesting, and again, I point to Kianga's previous comments on this, but I think there is some wiggle room here. How can AVCs, ReFi in particular, play a role in supporting aligned ecosystem actors' work? Because we see here the suggestion that the AVC could take a lead role in supporting Solidity Labs' work and offer its own vision and strategic perspective in aid of the ecosystem actor. So I think this is a very pertinent question. What is a sort of horizon of possibility in terms of AVCs interacting with ecosystem actors? This is an open question. It's a very key open question. Tokenized T-bills. This was from Bona Publica, TLDR. Tokenized T-bills present a promising opportunity for investors within DeFi landscape, offering risk-free yields, regulatory clarity, and better disclosure practices compared to traditional stablecoins. And the strategic importance, they can represent a modernized and transparent avenue to risk-free yield opportunities, aligning well with our AVC's strategic focus on innovation, transparency, and risk mitigation. Action item, ReFi AVC should consider supporting tokenized T-bill products due to their transparency and yield provision. And Kianga, we have an announcement about next week's, is that right, next week's guest?
Jake House is going to give us a presentation on their report. It'll be a learning session. So we did confirm that they'll be able to join us next week.
Hey. Amazing. Thank you, Kianga. And finally, a very, very interesting item of ecosystem intelligence from True Name, competing L1s pivoting to Ethereum L2s, CELO, a community hub for ReFi builders and projects. And the forum post that I think is very pertinent here, someone was posting in response to the original forum proposal. At the end of the day, I think what differentiates one network from another is its community, as technology can be forked and TVL can very easily move. The CELO community has a strong focus on ReFi, projects with positive impact in the real world and real use cases. In my opinion, it's because the community made it clear that it will make everything possible to have affordable transaction fees, and that the most vulnerable users should be protected, all the while having a positive impact on the planet. This is not the case in Ethereum, where many people have had funds locked due to high transaction fees, and whole dApps have been pushed away at the benefit of having a very decentralized and secure chain. And once again, we have a very alluring sort of piece of advice here. Possible action item is that perhaps the ReFi AVC can do special outreach to the CELO community. I'm checking the chat real quick. For Imperium, a good first step is probably to just clearly state who is responsible for sounding the alarm when an impairment or deficiency is discovered, and their pay is not tied to the success or failure of those assets or the assets of competitors. Yes, very, very good point. Republica is responding to that. An edit can be proposed to MIP 104, section 14.4 regarding current maintenance on LRAs and eventually offboarding into allocator DAOs. In my opinion, I don't think a new article is needed. Imperium is saying, well, right now, all monitoring is done by people who are paid by the size of the AUM or get funding from those who are paid size of the AUM. I'm relatively sure Steakhouse gets funds from Viridian and or Spring. Not even sure what the Viridian funding is doing. Republica says allocator DAOs will have skin in the game. Okay, let us move on. We are already at half past. So let's get to the topic, the really interesting podcast that Kianga shared. It was also the essay as well by Vitalik, and then he appeared on a podcast to discuss it. It discusses legitimacy. And I'd like to just right off the bat connect this idea of legitimacy with the protocol scope, which we're here to discuss, and specifically the new chain, the contingency of a possible halt and then a hard fork. I found a very interesting series of posts on the forum. This was in the article, The 5 Phases of the Endgame, where Rune wrote, the key feature of new chain is the ability to use hard forks as a governance mechanism to recover from catastrophic governance disputes, where an attacker with majority voting power forces minority token holders to shut down the protocol, or where an attacker abuses the ability to shut down the protocol. Code Knight asks, how does a minority convince other chains that their hard fork is the real one? The issue is how to tell the Ethereum blockchain and other chains which fork to follow. How is the ETH and DAI living on Ethereum going to know to follow the minority fork? Bridge security is a major unsolved issue as it is, without adding the complexity of supporting minority bridge forks. Rune answers, in normal conditions, fork choice is determined by the new chain validators, but a minority of NewGov token holders can trigger the fallback mechanism, which puts a fallback multi-sig in charge, which ideally consists of the major decentralized governance ecosystems on the destination blockchain of that bridge. And here we see in Protocol 4.4.3, the actual language. The fallback multi-sig is a simple multi-sig consisting of DAOs with fully decentralized and mature governance on the target blockchain and physical arranged structures separate from those that interact with legal recourse assets. Interesting note here, as I began to think about these questions, legitimacy is clearly social, communal, and relational, but it begins in the cognitive, psychological reality of the individual. Legitimacy is always perceived legitimacy. So the question is, how do we identify the real maker? Is this somehow connected to the founders and the core team? Is this somehow connected with the contributors, the core units, the ecosystem actors, many of which now are compelled to be anon, so an unknown to the community at large? Is it somehow connected to a continuity of values and the mission of MakerDAO? Somehow connected to the purpose to which the capital is deployed, in which case it is a metaphysical reality, as Vitalik says, like universal alignment. This phrase, universal alignment, which is so central to the Atlas, is definitely something like a metaphysical reality. Let's see, there is a question. Marion, thank you for sharing that. Our youth, your future is asking, mates, what is happening here? We are discussing a podcast and an essay blog by Vitalik on the issue of legitimacy, and we are just tying in that discussion to the protocol scope and its provision for the contingency of halting the new chain and executing a hard fork. So Kianga, I've definitely made some notes here, my friend, of some key
Sure,
ideas, but I would love to just pause here and see what was kind of inspiring your decision to discuss legitimacy, what sort of stood out for you in recommending that we look at this podcast and this essay.
Yes. Well, thank you. I love that overview. And, the article, I don't know how many on the call had a chance to read it or familiar with this discussion from 2 years ago. So it's kind of interesting to revisit the conversation 2 years later. And there's a lot of discussion as well about public goods funding. And the themes felt incredibly rich for a kind of first principles conversation. And one of the things we wanted to do with this ABC from the beginning is not just talk about the nitty gritty of maker governance or the technical wording of scopes, but hopefully for these subcommittee meetings to be interesting and accessible and be an opportunity for kind of philosophical or these kind of fundamental big brain conversations. And so, as I put in the channel earlier today, a little while ago, Vitalik introduces this discussion on legitimacy to talk about social force. There's like this social force. And it struck me that, the protocols, this was, maybe not the most obvious takeaway from the protocol scope, but since, I'm not a technical person and I don't know a lot about the technical aspects of the emergency shutdown mechanism and, what's being actually proposed at a technical level for new chain. But I understood that the purpose at the end of the day is so that MakerDAO could recover from the triggering of the emergency shutdown, and that to date, it hasn't been triggered. But that if it were, it would basically potentially mean the end of the project, the way, without this new chain architecture. And so this felt like a really great opportunity to use our forum to just really scratch the surface, begin to flesh out these broader views that would inform all of the decisions that will need to happen over a pretty long, well, we don't know, as we pointed out at the beginning of the call, we don't have a great sense of like what's actually being worked on now, how much has been decided or is being instructed relative to new chain. So that's like a really important, I think, thing, as many delegates pointed out, for us to get a better sense of. But yeah, legitimacy. And what's exciting and what I would love to hear from everyone who's been thinking about this or has views, whether it's about new chain or these articles. But it's exciting for ReFi as we think about power and control, and that so much of the discussion about whether things are centralized or decentralized or have single points of failure, there's sort of an assumption that, okay, if X participant has this much money or has this much kind of physical control, then that's the end of the story and they get to rule the day. And this article talks about, what happened with the fork of, now of course the title's, it's leaving my brain. But essentially, how can smaller groups or groups without financial power, how do we check ultimately the power that, this whole project of crypto in many ways was sort of launched out of a desire to check that kind of power, centralized power, legacy power. And so this question of legitimacy and the comfort that we can derive as a community that, we define what's legitimate and that's something that everyone can participate in and does participate in, regardless of how many tokens you have or don't have. And so that just as a theme was very inspiring. And I think to talk about it in the context of protocol would be a great way to bring these two things together and make sure that we have alignment and connection between our values and our philosophies around what a decentralized ecosystem, what an unbiased, uncensorable, unstoppable peer-to-peer stablecoin currency, what are the conditions in which people can have confidence in that? So New Chain is a mission to say, you can be confident and invest and use the MakerDAO ecosystem and this technology, because even though we have these terrific minority protections in terms of emergency shutdown, we also have a mechanism to recover. So those were just sort of the things that stood out to me and why I wanted to suggest this topic for today's meeting.
Amazing. Thank you, my friend. And I believe the blockchain name, Steem, right?
Yes, Steem and Hive. Thank you.
Steem and Hive. Okay. Steem and Hive, which was a very, very fascinating story that Vitalik wrote about in his essay. I'm going to pause here and see if anyone would like to come off mute or share any of their initial thoughts and perceptions about what Kianga shared or Vitalik's pod or essay. We'll be keen to see.
And also, if anyone on the call can share history about this conversation at MakerDAO. I understand that the topic of a new chain or maker chain is an old one, and that it's something Rune did not support for a long time. So if there's anyone who has insights into the progression of the conversation in the community, that would be welcome as well.
Great point, Kianga. Thank you. All right, friends. Well, because we don't see any hands going up, you are going to force me to go into the big philosophy section, the metaphysical discussions. I don't want to do this, but I think my hands are tied. Okay. Kianga is tellingly the only person who is texting, do it. Okay. So I'm going to take a roundabout way to sort of making my point, but I'm going to connect it all together. It's going to be a little bit of a scenic route. Perhaps some of you are familiar with George Gilder. He is a famed economist and writer. I think the last book he wrote, well, he just released a book, The End of Capitalism. The book before that was The End of Google, I think. And it was a very interesting book. He wrote it in 2018. And he has a 2012 book that I have read. And when I began digging into the legitimacy pod and essay, all these thoughts began to spark up and to connect with what George Gilder was writing about in this book. And so I want to read a couple of excerpts from him as his own account of what happened in the 2008 crash. And then again, it may be the scenic route, but I'll try to tie it all together. So the first thing he talks about is the subprime mortgage market. And he describes this very problematic situation very provocatively in the phrase that capitalism without capitalists. So this is what he writes. What was going on before the crash? Devoted to efficiency and financial intricacy, the policymakers, bankers, and money managers of America attenuated the ownership of the nation's assets. They pried apart the sources of knowledge from the sources of funds. A regime of capitalism without owners destroyed the information content in U.S. markets, prices, and products, breaking every close and informed time between themselves and their assets. Investors diversified, hedged, and insured themselves until they had not the slightest idea of the content of their holdings. Festooned with government guarantees and rating agency laurels, these securities were deemed the world's safest investments. So we see Gilder is sort of contrasting knowledge with power, or we could say financial leverage. And he's also hat tipping very directly this notion of legitimacy by calling in that there were government guarantees, there were rating AAA agency laurels. These securities were deemed the safest investments. This was from trusted authorities. So he's definitely hat tipping this notion of legitimacy. Andrew Redleaf, the founder of White Box Advisors, a hedge fund, was one of the first people to publicly call out what he saw. This was a train wreck happening. I believe he wrote this in 2005, 2006. He said, here is a flat out prediction for the new year. Sometime in the next 12 to 18 months, there is going to be a panic in credit markets. The driver in the credit market panic of 2007 or 2008 will be a sudden, profound, and pervasive loss of faith in the alchemy of structured finance as currently practiced. So when I read this line, sudden, profound, and pervasive loss of faith, I thought that this was a very provocative encapsulation of Vitalik's characterization of what legitimacy is. I'll get back to this. So here we have a key idea. This is how I'm getting back to actually MakerDAO and Endgame. Low entropy carrier, high entropy innovation. So this is what George Gilder writes about this. Rational choice, and he's still writing about the 2008 crash and the whole context behind that. Rational choice in the face of massive ignorance is meaningless. Capitalism depends not on the freedom to choose, but on the free flow of information across a low entropy carrier. Corrupt that carrier with noise and capitalism collapses. And the great corrupter of any carrier, the great generator of destructive noise, is power. And in this case, the powers assembled were immense. So again, he's calling out this notion of legitimacy. On the wrong side of the trades that brought down the economy were most of the world's central banks, the World Bank, the IMF, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, Citigroup, Merrill Lynch, Deutsche Bank, all established institutions with intimate government connections. So here what we're getting to is this dichotomy between knowledge and power. And what George Gilder puts forth in his book is an information theory of economics, but information not in sort of the staid sense that we are perhaps used to thinking of information. In his sense, in the information theory sense, information is disorder. It is surprisal, what he calls surprisal. It is entropy. It is what you were not expecting to hear. If what is communicated is everything that you anticipated, then it is not information. It is order, but not entropy. So again, in Gilder's sense, information is entropy, it's disorder, it's surprisal, it's upheaval of equilibrium, and it is the province of the capitalist who understands what he owns. The entrepreneur who is able to grasp the situation-specific optimum because they live and breathe that situation. This, in a nutshell, is Gilder's information theory of economics. And so key to this information theory of economics is the sort of polarity between order and disorder. High entropy information, again, information in this weird sense now, high entropy information generated by entrepreneurs presupposes a low entropy carrier. This has traditionally been the role of the nation state, but I would say this role is failing. The nation state is failing. And generative surprisal, the generative surprisal of entrepreneurs requires such a steady state foundation. So what are we to do about this dilemma? Knowledge and power. This is Gilder again. Key issue in economics is not aligning incentives with some putative public good, but aligning knowledge with power. Business investments have both a financial and an epistemic yield. Capitalism catalytically joins the two. If business hypotheses are shielded from falsification by political protections, government subsidies, bureaucratic mandates, they cannot yield knowledge, and in most cases, they destroy it. The power of politicized companies grows, but their knowledge degenerates into ideology. Self-justifying institutions, Harvard University, Fannie Mae, Goldman Sachs, loom over the economic and social landscape, distorting price and opportunity signals. The economy, Gilder writes, will not function without knowledge and transparency, information flowing freely across a low entropy carrier. Capital belongs in informed hands. Amen, Kianga. Amen. So I'm bringing this around, friends. Thank you for your patience. MakerDAO and Endgame. How is this relevant to MakerDAO and Endgame? First, let's look at blockchains, crypto networks. The low entropy carrier envisaged by Gilder's conception of an information theory of economics is, let's say, Ethereum. It's the L1, the layer 1, low entropy carrier. It can be counted on to be relatively stable. And the high entropy information layer on tap could be the dApps. So in the maker and the endgame context, how does this apply? Well, we hear Rune say frequently that the endgame was meant to address many things. For instance, voter apathy was one, but something that he brings up in a lot of interviews is the politicization of governance. And again, I couldn't help but think that Gilder's words here, that the great corrupter of any carrier is power, that this somehow resonates with Rune's characterization of politicization as one of the biggest hurdles that Endgame has to overcome. So here, what is the low entropy carrier of Endgame within the Endgame context? Well, you literally have an atlas that will be immutable, that cannot be changed once the Endgame state is entered into. So we see here Rune, the designer of the Endgame state, he is literally putting in a carrier that will not change at all. So as low entropy as it gets. Now the scope artifacts improvements, now there's definitely movement here, but what he does to constrain this is that there's incremental changes. AVCs are not able to push through drastic changes. They can only be incremental, and this is done at regular intervals. And it's achieved via several AVCs pulling in completely different directions. This is what is actually encouraged. Everyone's supposed to have their own strategic bias, and everyone's supposed to pull in their own independent directions. So you see that if a lot of different bodies and political powers are pulling in different directions, unlike the Democrat-Republican dichotomy in America, if there's tons of AVCs pulling in different directions, one is not going to be able to pull very far in its own direction. So here we also have, what's bringing up for me is a departure of Gov Alpha. And I definitely have a warning sign here, because if there is something that's absolutely crucial to low entropy carrier dynamic, it is governance. When governance functions well, it's completely invisible and we take it for granted. But now what we see is that we have lost some really high value contributors in governance back to back to back. There's a gaping hole. And the problem is that when we notice that gaping hole, it's too late for us to have done something proactive about it. So something that's very crucial to governance being the low entropy carrier that it needs to be is actually taking care of these contributors, figuring out what it is that's prompting the departures. Is it burnout? Is it cultural? Is it this? Is it that? And many of our line delegates have actually called this out for being addressed, but I think this is core. And another aspect that contributes to this low entropy carrier in the endgame scheme, the alignment conservers. There's many, just like there's many AVCs, there are many alignment conservers, and there's distributed power, distributed influence, checks and balances. And then finally, we have Maker Core itself as a part of this low entropy carrier dynamic, stripped to essentials. All the politicization, all the complication is pushed to the margins. Where is the high entropy information? Very simple. It's in the sub-DAO layer. And the cool thing here, as Rune explains, is that sub-DAOs that are politicized are going to flounder, and they're going to fail, and they're going to be completely disbanded. But the entrepreneurial sub-DAOs, that entrepreneurial information, that entropy, that intelligence of the collective ecosystem is going to rise to the top via competition. This is the idea, anyway. August, yes, you're right. Governance is treated like the goalie, only playing when it goes wrong. Yes. So Gilder on libertarianism and spontaneous order. This is a bit of a reach, and maybe it will be unpalatable to many of you out there. But I have this idea, and again, I was reminded of this while reading Gilder. He He described this idea of spontaneous order as an intellectual swamp. He disagrees with it. He says there's no such thing as spontaneous order. There's no such thing as self-organization. He writes, on the farther shores of libertarianism, belief in spontaneous order leads to the indulgence of anarchy, prompting theorists to regard all order as unnecessary tyranny. But I think the point he's trying to make is that it has to be both. It's not either or. It's a polarity. We need order in the form of a low entropy carrier, and then we need disorder or disequilibrium or creativity and innovation as a layer on top of that. So he's actually saying it takes a lot of intentionality and effort to create that low carrier order. I'm going to pause. Let's see. Bonapublica, it's difficult to imagine anything related to blockchains and finance as a low entropy carrier. And Kyanga says, yes, it's relative. Kyanga, I'm going to pause here, my friend. You just came off mute.
Yes. This is so core to, the conversation about new chain. And in fact, I hope the delegates can help us think about, how to have this conversation and bridging what we're talking about here with the technical layer, because I don't feel equipped to really articulate it, but the reliability of what we think won't change, and to some extent, this is whether it's Ethereum or as an L1, the pivot that some other L1s are doing, as True pointed out with the CELO blockchain, becoming L2s, exactly how I think I've also seen new chain is not an L, it's not even an L1, it's not an L2, it's like there's another terminology for how to think about the maker chain in all of this context, but it just would be great to figure out a way. Maybe there's like a mirror board session we could do on this, how to really put all these pieces together, where we're thinking about and also as you pointed out, which I love, which is like the ossification that we talk about between the atlas, the immutable elements versus the mutable elements, and where we need to have this foundation, this lack of change, and how does that tie into the legitimacy, the social force, and love your tie-in with the financial crisis, and of course the faith and confidence that is really the thing that's providing value to everything, especially fiat currencies, more or less, and all of the bank runs, all of this comes down to, these social forces that you've been talking about and that were in this article. And if we can figure out a way to discuss this in an integrated way with the technical advances and the choices that are being made there, this will only increase then, I think, that social force, that legitimacy that MakerDAO is going to rely on if any of this ever gets triggered in the future. And that, during the pregame, we have this opportunity by having the focused conversations. And I love that, ReFi can, maybe be a hub for some of those conversations, and the documentation, Carola, and I have to applaud you and thank you for the great structure you've proposed, because now we're having something of a legislative record, or the written forum has been crucial, I think, in helping to define what's legitimate and what the culture is in crypto, and that's something we can be doing now in the pregame, so that there's this bench, there's a moat, there's like a bank of what the community agrees is legitimate. And we're going to need to draw on that bank at some point if there's ever a hard fork that's meant to actually restore the protocol. That's something we can be doing every single day. And so I'm excited about that. And I hope everyone on the call will join us in the documentation and the analysis and the discussion, and really put your words into the record so that we have this this repository that we can draw upon later for the legitimacy we would need in the event that there's an attack that is going to take more than financial resources to succeed, and that's the empowerment every single person can have in this ecosystem.
Yes, Kianga, well said. It's already almost 1 p.m., so I'm just going to plan to wrap up. Please feel free in the last few minutes to come off mute or tap any comments in our chat. Let me see. Possible to draw some parallels if we think abstractly. Bona Publica is talking about blockchains, anything related to blockchains as low entropy carrier. Navigator would be interested in getting Solidity Lab's views as some of their introductory material has gestured in this direction. Our youth, your future, perhaps you should consider inviting people from the Cosmos Hub to explain IBC. Let's see here. Actually, Bona Publica, I may have time because I know you've asked about this. Let me see if I can find this. Okay, so where is this? Okay, so Bona Publica. This is what I'm thinking about when I say blockchain, and there's aspects of blockchain that can apply to this characterization of it being a low entropy carrier. So De Filippi is a long-standing researcher in the blockchain field, and he describes blockchain as a confidence machine. So De Filippi was basically negating this narrative of blockchains as being trustless. But they were also saying, okay, so maybe they're trustless, but no other researcher has said, what takes the place of trust. So this person's theory is that blockchain is a confidence machine, that trust is something that applies to people and sort of denotes vulnerability, the feeling of vulnerability, an emotional state of vulnerability, whereas confidence applies to processes, protocols, and things, and really sort of brings up this notion of predictability. It's based on our previous experiences with the protocol, with the process. We found it to be aligning with our expectations of how it runs again and again. So this is how blockchain technology is a low entropy carrier. This is from De Filippi. It produces confidence, not trust, in blockchain-based systems based on an understanding of their procedural and rule-based functioning. So we have mathematical knowledge, cryptographic rules, which again are low entropy. Once you have coded them, then that's how they will run until they're changed. And then this creates strong expectations about the proper operations of blockchain-based systems. So because there's a long-standing account of its past performance, everything is transparent, everything is coded, everything is algorithmic, everything is deterministic. What it does is technology increases confidence in these systems and eliminates the need for a centralized, trusted authority. De Filippi says, while trust is less relevant when it comes to a blockchain-based system, it is nonetheless necessary to trust the actors securing and maintain the underlying blockchain network. And De Filippi says confidence in a procedural system such as a blockchain ultimately depends on the proper governance of that system. This means that the increased confidence derived from the use of blockchain technology is inherently correlated with the degree to which the various actors involved in the governance can be trusted to act as expected. So I hope that was a little bit clarifying of where I was going with this, but I agree with you. Much of finance cannot be described as low entropy carrier, but I think this is where I was going with the blockchain. It's really the architecture, and Vitalik actually brings this up in his pod appearance. He says that decentralized architecture of blockchains gives people a feeling of safety. He literally said that. That's a direct quote. So that's what I mean by low carrier.
Yeah, I think that predictability is such an important call out, so that, and as I think about GovAlpha departing, and it's so cool that we've got guests who are participating in that, in the training, because that to me is also like so key in legitimacy and security and trust, but it's a little bit different, and even if it's changing, to the extent that you have a sense of how things can change, even if they do change, they change in the ways that you expect, or as contributors, and I think the whole structure of Endgame is kind of designed around that principle and the AI elements, and essentially being able to have 10,000 of pages of rule sets and then being able to access and traverse that through the language models means we can potentially really nail the predictability aspect, which is a huge part of I think that the trust piece.
Yes, agreed. And if I can just show one last thing, because I'm interested to see if anyone in the community has a take on this. This quote is directly from Vitalik's essay, Maker versus Tether. I couldn't help but think as I'm reading this quote that there's something about cultural stickiness here, and this is related to legitimacy. But in this essay, Vitalik writes, an interesting case study in this regard is the case of Tether versus DAI. Tether has many scandals. Again, this was 2 years ago. Tether has many scandals, but despite this, traders use Tether to hold and move around dollars all the time. The more decentralized and transparent DAI, despite its benefits, is unable to take away much of Tether's market share, at least as far as traders go. So I'm curious to see if anyone can come off mute or type something in the chat that perhaps gives some insight into the I wouldn't say lack of cultural stickiness, but it seems like we have quite a ways to go with cultural stickiness. I wonder why this is. I can only say, and I'm relatively new to the Maker ecosystem, is my impression of Maker relatively staid, very serious, very conservative, very competent. I mean, it's very impressive to even just to be exposed even superficially to the thinkers and the builders in this ecosystem. And that's not at all an insult. That's a wonderful, wonderful thing. But I wonder if, and again, this is just my sort of superficial hypothesis, that there wasn't, I don't know, there seems to be lacking that sort of sticky, powerful narrative, resonant narrative that really helps to drive this idea of legitimacy as a social force. Kianga, what do you think?
Yeah, it's I just put in the chat. I'm so glad you brought this up, because this was like, I have my notes. This is the big like booyah, this article for us. And that, that I think the narrative, particularly, with Tether doing so well, in quotes, hate to see it, love to see it, right? And there's discussion, of course, of it being used, I think, in the Spark protocol or, somewhere in the sub-DAO ecosystem because of its utility, because it works. But I don't think we've given ourselves enough credit for DAI and the power, the social currency that it has. And there's, we had some folks from the LATAM ambassador program, and we heard, one of our first meetings, we heard about perspectives about DAI and how DAI is actually being used. And, there's a debate as to whether anyone really cares. So people often say, no one cares if it's decentralized. No one cares about this. No one cares about that. But I disagree. And there's a bunch of places in this article where I think Vitalik makes the argument over and over again about the contributions that a project may be making to the ecosystem, and that is going to factor into people's choices. And, we see that Spark, Phoenix Labs decided to share revenues with Aave, right? Because from forking their code. And, I think that's an example of where MakerDAO is leading with its values. And maybe the new brand is going to help us with this, which is a kind of coherency and an ability for us to message in a way that people can understand and actually people, the new brand's meant to really appeal to the masses, right? And so I think I think it does matter. I think it's going to matter more. It has to work. It has to be useful for traders and all, we have to navigate all of those things. But I really do believe that what Vitalik's pointing out here is a powerful asset that has been under leveraged in the community, and where we're really just set up to just run with that and enhance the social force that's going to, propel Maker to the top of the whatever chart.
Thank you, Kianga. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, Navigator, I absolutely agree. That yeah, and I think that the brand of DAI has, of course, given what's happened in the past couple of months, and the brand for Maker, despite what the charts say and some naysayers say and some haters, we at Refi, we're super long, obviously, Maker and bullish. And I don't know, I think at any moment, maybe it's already happened. Did the smart burn engine kick off? So we're excited about the future and hope that Refi can, be a community of conversations and governance nerds that play a big role in the future of Endgame and Maker and our stablecoin.
Yes, here, my friend. Well, thank you to everyone who's listening. Thank you to our friends from DAO Masons who hopped in on the call. We once again encourage you to check out the forum where I'll post the slides. There was quite a bit of stuff that I was not able to go into. The slides are always available to you. We have a Notion website where we keep all of these resources for the community, so feel free to dive in there. And with that, if there are no further questions or comments, thank you, Our Youth, Your Future. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Jord. Thank you for being here. Have a wonderful, wonderful week, and we will see you next week.